Hi, everyone. My name is Brooke, and this is I'll Be On Tonight, a podcast dedicated to discussing the history and literature of Great Britain in the 19th and 20th centuries. For those who are curious or confused about this show's name, I'll Be On is an archaic and poetic name for Britain that just so happened to also make a nice cheesy pun. Kind of like the word that old men would use in their poetry and stuff. So I'm really interested in what history can tell us about ourselves and others, and I hope that the stories that I share may be empowering, interesting, and informative. I just got my bachelor's degree in history, and so I've attempted to apply legitimate approaches to historical inquiry, research, and presentation as outlined by my scholar community for this series. Of course, a podcast is a little bit more casual than a historical research paper, but I still make sure to verify my sources and provide you a list of all the sources that I've used. So I just like to include this little disclaimer, as I think it is important for everybody to know where their information comes from and the methods that were used to obtain it. And like I said, at the end of this recording, I will provide a list of all of my sources for those of you who are interested in the form of a typed bibliography. So without further ado, I'd like to start my first episode of my first ever podcast. The first series of I'll Be On Tonight is going to be called Eating Women, with eating used as an adjective or participle and not a verb. So it's about women who eat, not about cannibalism. But hey, I caught your attention, huh? This series will be all about the socio-cultural history of food, dining, and issues related to diet or eating, particularly in terms of how these histories relate to the experiences of 19th and or 20th century women. I always have so many questions about this stuff myself, so I thought I'd answer them for me and for the people who also have them. Today, I have my husband Alex joining me tonight so that he can ask me questions like the ones you might all have, and so he can enjoy his fun commentary.
Hello.
Say hello.
Hi.
Anything you want to add?
I'm excited to learn about eating women.
Amazing. We're going to answer some really exciting questions this season, like how did restaurants originate and what made them popular? And how did colonialism affect food? Or what's up with soda and lemonade in the past? Do they exist? Do people like them? We'll answer all of these questions and more, all with a little twist, and bring in all those women you never even knew you wanted to hear about. But today, we are actually going to talk a bit about some women who chose not to eat. The British suffragettes who went on hunger strikes for their right to vote. So really, I should call this not eating women. All right. I went a little too far there, but it's time to actually get into the good stuff. So all this stuff is going to be based in the British suffragette movement, which happened around the early 1900s with origins in the early 1800s, similar to the U.S. movement. So basically, one of the essential things to understand about the women's suffrage movement in the UK is that it's a little bit different from some other ones in places like the U.S., and that there's two different groups of women who are fighting for the right to vote. So these two organizations that develop, both of them are asking for the right of women to have the vote on equal terms to men, but both are going to use different methods. So first, there's going to be the Women's Social and Political Union, which is abbreviated as WSPU or WSP, if you're me. And this is the one that a lot of people are more familiar with being depicted in popular culture, like the book The Dictionary of Lost Words or things like that. And it was led by the Pankhurst family, Emmeline Pankhurst, and her two daughters, Christabel and Sylvia. And also her husband helped a lot. So you kind of have these families that are in it. And the WSPU has roots going back to the end of the 19th century. So that would be the late 1800s. Back then, they had a different name and were technically a different group, but they had a lot of the same principles. They started working with this group called the Independent Labour Party, which was this new political party in Britain that had come up to fight for the rights of the regular working man. And so people like the Pinkhursts thought that since the people in the Labour Party really wanted to represent people who didn't have the right to vote, like working men and just people who were kind of on the bottom rung of society, they also thought they would be interested in helping other people vote, like women. But unfortunately, turns out that these men were really only interested in themselves and getting the right to vote themselves. So, you know, giving the women the vote, if you think about it, makes them feel like their new vote matters less. So, of course, there's different arguments, but I think that's kind of the main way to understand why the Labour Party ended up not really helping these women, because they were newly enfranchised, and enfranchising more people made their enfranchisement matter less. So, of course, these women got kind of disillusioned with all that, and they said, screw you guys, we're going to become the Women's Social and Political Union now, and we are going to fight for our own right to vote without you. And our phrase is going to be deeds, not words. So they were all about action. They were about being visible, about making noise. They really invoked figures like Joan of Arc, you know, kind of women who are knights, women who are warriors. They were about being militant and everything like that. So you can really see that the WSPU was an action-driven cause for these women. They had been ignored for a really long time, and they were ready to be heard. And they're really tired of just sitting down at the table and using these constitutional channels that haven't worked for them. So this movement led by the WSPU is what ends up being called the suffragette movement in Britain. And it's really important when talking about this topic to remember that suffragette means something different than suffragist in Britain, because suffragist is going to apply to the other group that we're about to talk about. So the suffragettes is that militant movement that I just described, that really action-driven one. And now I'm going to tell you about the other organization, which was called the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. I know, what a fancy name, right? So this also has roots going back to the late 19th century. So as you can see with both these groups, women have really been thinking about these rights, about the vote for a long time. And it's kind of been a process. They've gotten more rights to education and everything. And now they're like, okay, we want to vote for our leaders. So the people in the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, they're mainly upper class and middle class women, and they welcome working class women as well. But they're usually women who don't have to go to work during the day, so they can take time on these suffragist meetings. So they are trying to lobby the government, and they want to use legal avenues. They want to get people in parliament who are going to vote for them to have the right to vote. So you can see that the divide in this movement is very similar to a lot of social justice movements that we've seen both here in the U.S., where I'm from, and globally. There's often a more peaceful protesting faction, and then there's often a more militant faction. So that's kind of what we have going on here with the British suffrage movement as well. And so it's going to be the suffragettes who get put in jail and go on these hunger strikes. So that's kind of a little introduction to the suffragette movement in Britain. And please feel free to email me more questions about this stuff, because I'm obsessed with this stuff. I'm going to share my email at the end of this podcast. Do you have any questions, any comments, Alex?
No, not really. I mean, I just think it's interesting how two parties formed, and it's very confusing. It's very easy to get mixed up with the suffragettes and suffragettes.
Yeah. They're very similar names.
Suffragettes.
Even at the time, you'll see people using some of them interchangeably, but it was really important to the suffragists that they were different than suffragettes, because they didn't want to be associated with the violent protesting.
I wonder if they ever did get confused at times. They're like, no, we're not suffragists. We're suffragette. Or sorry, we're not suffragists. We're suffragettes. Like,
yeah, it's so interesting how these little divisions matter so much to us as people, and those nuances make a big difference. Just the end of the word makes a big difference of what kind of person you were talking about, especially with the assumptions made at this time about disorderly women like the suffragettes being bad, and more demure women like the suffragists being more polite and acceptable to society. So, yeah, really interesting. All right. So, the WSPU, led by the Pankhursts, they are doing things to get arrested. This is part of what they want. This is part of why they're making noise, because they want to be noticed. They want to be noteworthy. They want people to start actually paying attention to their cause as a legitimate cause. So just some of the things they've done famously to get into the situation where they're getting arrested. They often protested and made a racket outside of Parliament. There's a very famous picture that I'm also going to post of Emmeline Pankhurst being carried away from the gates of Parliament by a policeman, and she's kicking and she's shouting. So, they're kind of making a statement that we're not going to be these quiet, demure, submissive women you want us to be. We are new women who deserve different kinds of considerations. Another really famous thing that they do is what's called a day on Regent Street. In 1913, they all go shopping on Regent Street, which is a high-class shopping street in London. And basically, at a prescribed time, they just pull out hatchets and weapons and tools, and they start breaking the windows of the shops. It's really intense, but there are a couple reasons why someone might have thought this was a good idea. Like, shopping was a very female-coded activity. Department stores were one of the only places women could go out publicly and comfortably at a time like this. So by doing so, they kind of turn this space that's kind of been female-coded and domestically coded into a different kind of space that becomes a political statement. Plus, all of these fancy shops on Regent Street, they care about your buying power as a woman because you're the one doing the shopping. So you're trying to kind of get them to realize that if they still want their business, they got to care about your vote too. But that's not to say that some of the things they did were very violent, sometimes bordering on terroristic, and had consequences. One of them, or some of them, set fire to a building in Kew Gardens. There's also quite a few other fires they set.
Not the plants.
I know. Unlike what the plants do. But, it was a very visible place. It was a place that people cared about. They actually bombed some places as well. Someone throws a hatchet at the prime minister one time. He lives.
Wait, did it hit him?
I think it missed.
Oh.
I want to say that it missed.
And this is like early 1900s.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is like early 1900s. Sometime between 1900 and 1913.
Okay.
This is kind of a summary of events. There's some other events later related to the hunger strikes that I have specific dates for. There is a famous girl named Emily Willing Davison who runs out in front of the King's Horse at a race course. She's waving her WSPU banner, and then she gets ran over by the horse and killed, and it becomes like a big news story. There's a ton of historical debate about whether she actually wanted to be killed by the horse or if she just kind of wanted to create a commotion. So you can look at that both ways and respect both ways. So these are kind of two perspectives to take on this, and there's many nuances, and you can kind of see that they're both coexisting in this moment. These women felt so powerless and so misunderstood and unheard that they thought it was necessary to do things that were so extreme and wild. It's like when you're a kid and you feel like no one's listening, so you feel like you have to scream really loud, or, you think that really is a way that a kind of patriarchal sexist society could make women feel. And also at the same time, we can recognize that it's also true that these acts were and could be very cruel and very hurtful to those who are injured and to whose property was damaged. The important thing to remember about history is that it happened in real life and not in a storybook. It happened in a world that is not as foreign as our own that we like to believe. And so things are not simple. They're not black and white. And they're complicated like this, where many multiple things are true at the same time. And arguments can be made for both sides. And that's kind of what this podcast and sharing history is all about. It's about looking at history as complicated and as having tensions on all sides. And We're going to continue to do that today and always on this podcast. And a little fun fact for you relating to breaking shop windows. Actually, before a day on Regent Street, some suffragettes had apparently broken the windows at Fortnum and Mason, which is this really old fancy store in London. And Fortnum and Mason claims to have sent them little picnic baskets in return. They say on their website, quote, "When the suffragettes were imprisoned for smashing our windows in 1911, we sent them hampers," which are picnic baskets, "after they were released from Holloway Prison, containing the likes of our famous beef tea. Their contents were intended to help build up their strength," unquote. And I just love the very British, the very little casual, cute little Fortnum and Mason. You know, here you go. Here's some posh hampers for you to feel better and
please stay away.
Continue your movement. Please don't break our windows again. Just drink this beef tea and you'll like us again. You know, also they probably now want to be on the right side of history. So like, oh yeah, make sure to emphasize that on our website. So some of these events I mentioned happened after the hunger strikes and some before. But I think they kind of do a good job of showing us what this movement is like, what it's about, what kind of things are happening. They range from like protests where nobody gets hurt that are just very loud and rowdy, like the ones in front of Parliament, to the ones that are pretty violent, like the bombings. And they're doing all this stuff, like I said, because they want to get arrested. Because if you get arrested and you're put in prison, then you have the possibility of being deemed a political prisoner or a prisoner of conscience. And if these women can get the government to deem them political prisoners, then it also means that the government is recognizing that their cause, their fight for suffrage, is a legitimate political cause. Because there were so many people at this time that were diminishing this movement as something that old maids did because they got rejected or because they were unwomanly women. And, you know, in some ways, one of the main strategies to protest against the suffragette movement was to not take it seriously as a legitimate cause, because women were not really considered citizens in the same way that men were, because they didn't have the right to vote. And it wasn't until very recently that they even had the right to their own property. So it was really easy for people to say, oh, this isn't legitimate. Oh, these are illogical, silly women. We have lots of anti-suffrage images, ranging from some really racist ones to ones of like women kidnapping men to make them marry them, because obviously they only want the vote because men didn't want to marry them. And we also have my favorite, which is this card that has a crying baby on it. And it says, "Mummy's a suffragette," implying that, like, because the mom's a suffragette, she has completely abandoned her child to go vote for a couple minutes. And the child is so unhappy about that. So there you go. There's a little bit of background. So now we're going to talk about how these arrests lead to hunger strikes and force feeding. It's about to get intense.
Ooh.
Buckle in.
I'm buckled in.
Okay.
I got my snacks. I got my Trader Joe's ketchup chips.
The best kind, not a sponsor. So there's this historian guy named Ian Miller. He wrote this book called A History of Force Feeding, and he had a very helpful chapter on how these hunger strikes got started. So according to Ian Miller and his sources, the hunger strike started with a woman named Marion Wallace Dunlop. Let's have a little clap for her. So she was a very hardcore member of the WSPU. She was participating in as many protests, marches, and acts of disobedience as she could. This was clearly a very important cause to her. In 1909, she wrote on the side of the House of Commons, which is a very, very old building where Parliament meets. And this is what she wrote. She wrote, quote, "It is the right of the subject to petition the king, and all commitments and prosecutions for such petitioning are illegal," end quote. which comes from the English Bill of Rights, which is like the closest thing they got to a written constitution other than the Magna Carta. So this is an important document, and this is an important part of English law. So she's using some good arguments here, but it is unfortunately vandalism to write on the side of the House of Commons. So big surprise, she gets arrested for this. It's not her first time being arrested. She's been arrested for some of the other things. But this time, when she gets taken to Holloway Prison, which was one of the most common women's prisons at the time, she gets there and she decides, just of her own accord, that she's going to go on hunger strike. So this isn't organized by the WSPU or anything at first. It's just her thinking, you know what? I'm going to hunger strike to protest against what's being done to me. Hunger strikes had been seen in a couple other places before this, so there is kind of like a contemporary inspiration for this. There's some Russian prisoners who went on hunger strike for something and things like that that are kind of noteworthy at the time. So she's kind of like, I'm going to do this too, and I'm going to do it for myself. So she's just like, I'm not going to eat food. I want my demands to be met. I want the vote, or I'm not going to eat. Simple enough. So basically, I kind of imagine her making this little statement, she's just standing up for herself and saying, you can't tell me I can't vote. You can tell me all these things you want me to do, but you can't make me eat. Like, this is my body. I'm at least going to have control over my body. I'm a person and not just a thing. I mean, we'll never know what she said, but these are kind of the associations that this choice is having. And so when she chooses not to eat, it really freaks out the prison officials. This is pretty unprecedented. They don't really know what to do. They're kind of freaking out, and they're like, there's this frail woman and she's not eating, and we're really scared that she's going to die. And so she ends up, once again, according to Miller, she's released after 4 days of hunger striking. So she is not force-fed because they're really confused about what to do. This hasn't happened before. They're like, you know what? We're not going to cause big noise about this. We're just going to let her go now. And so, yeah. So this continues to encourage that whole thing that I talked about earlier, about women trying to get arrested and be a political prisoner, because also she's thinking, like I said, there were other political prisoners at the time, I think. They were hunger striking. So she's kind of trying to be like, hey, I'm a political prisoner. So it continues to inspire that. And at first, like, this is actually perceived or like seemingly pretty successful, it seems like, because it initially really stumps the government. They don't know what to do. And so I think that probably really inspired what's going to happen next, is that more and more women start going into prison and hunger striking too, after seeing that she succeeded in this. She didn't succeed in being deemed a political prisoner, but she succeeded in kind of, getting what she wanted out of the government, getting them to release her, getting them to behave differently, confusing them. But now there's a lot of women hunger striking, or there's about to be. And so the government is kind of faced with this dilemma. They're in a bit of a pickle because you have tons of women who are, for lack of a better word, starving themselves. And you don't want to let them die because that looks pretty bad on you. But you also don't want to just let them out of prison initially, because then you're not reinforcing the rules that you put in place in like a large scale. So the government tries to find an in-between and starts to do something called force feeding, or at the time it was called forcible feeding, where they force food down the nostrils, throats, and mouths of these women. And that's kind of like a form of torture in a lot of ways. So I'm about to read you the account of Mary Lay, who was one of the first women to be force-fed after hunger striking. So this is a bit long of an account, but I'm going to read a large chunk of it, as I think it illustrates this experience far better than I can, and because it's one of her official statements, and because she's a real person, and I think we should hear her real experience and her real words. So without further ado. Here we go. Quote, Statement of Mrs. Mary Lay. On my arrival at Winson Green Jail on Wednesday afternoon, I protested against the treatment to which I was subjected and broke the windows in my cell. Accordingly, at 9 o'clock in the evening, I was taken to the punishment cell, a cold, dark room on the ground floor. Light only shines on very bright days. No furniture in it. A plank bed was brought in. I was then stripped and handcuffed with the hands behind during the day, except at meals, when the palms were placed together in front. At night, they were also placed in front with the palms out. On Thursday, food was brought into the cell. Potatoes, bread, and gruel. But I did not touch it. Thursday afternoon, the visiting magistrates came. I was taken before them handcuffed. After hearing what I had to say, they sentenced me to 9 days close confinement with bread and water and to lose 42 days remission marks and pay damage. The handcuffs were removed at midnight on Thursday by the matron's order. I still refrained from food. About noon on Saturday, I was told the matron wished to speak to me and was taken to the doctor's room, where I saw the matron, 8 wardesses, and 2 doctors. There was a sheet on the floor and an armchair on it. The doctor said I was to sit down, and I did. He then said, "You must listen carefully to what I have to say. I have orders from my superior officers." He had a blue official paper in his hand to which he referred, "that you are not to be released, even on medical grounds." Unlike Marion Dunlop. "If you still refrain from food, I must take other measures to compel you to take it." I then said, "I refuse, and if you force food on me, I want to know how you are going to do it." He said, "This is a matter for me to decide." I said he must prove I was insane, and the lunacy commissioners would have to be summoned to prove I was insane, and he could not perform an operation without the patient's consent. The feeding by the mouth I described as an operation, and the feeding by the tube as an outrage. I also said, "I shall hold you responsible and shall take any measure in order to see whether you are justified in doing so." He merely bowed and said, "Those are my orders." I was then surrounded, forced back on the chair, which was tilted backwards. There were about 10 of them. The doctor that forced my mouth so as to form a pouch. The doctor then forced my mouth so as to form a pouch and held me while one of the wardesses poured some liquid from a spoon. It was milk and brandy. After giving me what he thought was sufficient, he sprinkled me with eau de cologne, and wardesses then escorted me to another cell on the first floor, where I remained 2 days. I should explain they're sprinkling them with cologne because it was apparently believed and also apparently possible to become smelly from not eating. Back to the story. On Saturday afternoon, the wardesses forced me on the bed, and the 2 doctors came in with them. And while I was held down, a nasal tube was inserted. It is 2 yards long, with a funnel at the end. There is a glass junction in the middle to see if the liquid is passing. The end is put up the nostril one day and the other nostril the other. Great pain is experienced during the process, both mental and physical. One doctor inserted the end up my nostril while I was held down by the wardesses, during which they must have seen my pain. For the other doctor interfered. The matron and 2 of the wardesses were in tears, and they stopped and resorted to feeding me by the spoon as in the morning. More eau de cologne was used. The food was milk. I was then put to bed in the cell, which is a punishment cell on the first floor. The doctor felt my pulse and asked me to take food each time, but I refused. On Sunday he came in and implored me to be amenable and have food in the proper way. I still refused. I was fed by the spoon up to Saturday, October 2nd, 3 times a day. From 4 to 5 wardesses and the 2 doctors were present on each occasion. Each time the same doctor forced my mouth, the other doctor assisted and held my nose on nearly every occasion. On Monday, 27th September, I was taken to a hospital cell, where I was fed by spoon in similar fashion. On Tuesday, 28th, a feeding cup was used for the first time, and Benger's food poured into my mouth for breakfast and supper, and beef teas midday. On Tuesday afternoon, I overheard Miss Edwards, on issuing from the padded cell opposite, call out, "Locked in a padded cell since Sunday." I then called out to her, but she was rushed into it. I then applied, Tuesday afternoon, to see the visiting magistrates. I saw them and wished to know if one of our women was in a padded cell, and if so, she must be allowed out. I knew she had a weak heart and was susceptible to excitement, and it would be very bad for her if kept there longer. I was told no prisoner could interfere on behalf of another. Any complaint on my own behalf would be listened to. I then said this protest of mine must be made on behalf of this prisoner, and if they had no authority to intervene on her behalf, it was no use applying to them for anything. After they had gone, I made my protest by breaking 11 panes in my hospital cell. I was then fed in the same way by the feeding cup and taken to the padded cell, where I was stripped of all clothing and a nightdress and bed given to me. As they took Miss Edwards out, they put me into her bed, which was still warm. The cell is lined with some padded stuff, India rubber or something. There was no air, and it was suffocating. This was on Tuesday evening. I remained there until the Wednesday evening, still being fed by force. I was then taken back to the same hospital cell and remained there until Saturday, October 2nd. Noon feeding being continued in the same way. On Saturday, October 2nd, about dinner time, I determined on stronger measures and to barricade my cell. I piled my bed, table, and chair by jamming them together against the door. They had to bring some men warders to get in with iron staves. I kept them at bay about 3 hours. They threatened to use the fire hose. They used all sorts of threats of punishment. When they got in, the chief warder threatened me and tried to provoke me to violence. The wardresses were there, and he had no business to enter my cell, much less to use the threatening attitude. I was again placed in the padded cell, where I remained until Saturday evening. I still refused food, and I was allowed to starve until Sunday noon. Food was brought, but not forced during that interval. Sunday noon, 4 wardresses and 2 doctors entered my cell and forcibly fed me by the tube through the nostrils with milk. Sunday evening, I was also fed through the nostril. I remained in the padded cell until Monday evening, October 4th. Since then, I have been fed through the nostril twice a day and by spoon midday, the last being meat juice, which doesn't require a tube, being only a small quantity. The sensation is most painful. The drums of the ear seem to be bursting. A horrible pain in the throat and the breast. The tube is pushed down 20 inches. I have to lie on the bed pinned down by wardresses. One doctor stands up on a chair holding the funnel end at arm's length, so as to have the funnel end above the level, and then the other doctor, who is behind, forces the other end up the nostrils. The one holding the funnel end pours the liquid down. About a pint of milk, sometimes egg and milk, are used. When the glass junction shows the fluid has gone down, a signal is given, a basin of warm water is put under my chin, and the other doctor withdraws the tube and plunges the end into the water. Before and after use, they test my heart and make a lot of examination. The after effects are a feeling of faintness, a sense of great pain in the diaphragm or breastbone, in the nose and the ears. The tube must go below the breastbone, though I can't feel it below there. I was very sick on the first occasion after the tube was withdrawn. I have also suffered from bad indigestion. I am fed in this way very irregularly. I have used no violence, though having provocation and being fed by force. I resist and am overcome by weight of numbers. If the doctor doesn't think the fluid is going down sufficiently swiftly, he pinches my nose with the tube in it and my throat, causing me increased pain. End of quote. So, this statement that Mary Lay made was published in a suffragette pamphlet while she was still in jail in 1909. So this became public knowledge. And also, this is her statement that she is going to use when she actually brings this case to trial, because she believes that what was done to her was illegal, as you saw her saying to the doctor, that I will see if you are justified in doing this to me. I read that account, though it is difficult because I think it shows how these women could be treated in prison, some of the similarities between how they were treated to asylum patients, and that assumption that women were crazy and unreasonable when they were trying to make change. But also to kind of give you some details about the kinds of food that people were force-fed, the kinds of pain that was in this experience, that was part of this experience. And like Mary Lay, many people suffered indigestion and health problems afterwards as well. So this was a really big deal that had a very large impact on them in the moment and their physical experience and emotional experience, but also throughout their lives. So she was fed lots of things like milk, eggs. I'm pretty sure they were raw eggs, which is incredibly nasty. She was also force-fed beef tea, so I'm not sure that beef tea in those suffragette hampers is gonna sound too good. Yeah.
And what was that? The bourbon or?
Oh, the fluid that she talks about. It's a brand. I think it's also a brand of like beef or some sort of meat broth tea.
I mean, like,
whiskey.
Yeah, whiskey. That's what it was.
Yes, milk and whiskey. Yeah. They thought alcohol would really, stimulate you. So if you're sick, you drink a little bit of alcohol and you feel a bit better. Your blood starts rushing.
Yeah,
mixing it with like milk is
milk and whiskey.
Pretty nasty.
I'm like, that is an interesting combo.
Yeah. So not only is this like a really torturous experience of having things forced into your body, but like they're nasty, nasty things as well. There's another suffragette who also has a personal account of this experience. And her account, she just kept popping up during my research. She's actually an American who had come over and joined the British suffragette movement, taking what she learned in Britain home with her to America. But while she was in England, she clearly got into some trouble because she was also arrested and force-fed. And she was in Holloway jail. She reported, quote, "During this operation, force feeding, the largest wardess in Holloway sat astride my knees, holding my shoulders down to keep me from bending forward. 2 other wardesses sat on either side and held my arms. Then a towel was placed around my throat, and one doctor from behind forced my neck back, while another doctor put a tube in my nostril. When it reached my throat, my head was pushed forward." End quote. And her account was also published in a newspaper. So these are things that they're sharing their experiences because they want their injustices to be recognized. So what is so interesting about both Mary Lay, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It might be Lee, but it's Leigh.
I feel like it's Lay.
Yeah. So sorry if you know that it's pronounced differently, whoever's listening, but we're going to go with Lay. So both Lay and Paul in these descriptions, you have doctors forcing things upon their bodies, but also the ones who have to physically straddle them and hold them down. They're using wardesses. So these are women wardens in prison. So you really see the weird gender dynamics that they're kind of trying to work through and figure out at this time in this, because seemingly it's inappropriate for the male doctors to hold a woman down, to be the one to, straddle her, because that's too like reminiscent of other kinds of violence and other kinds of things, but not to force the tube through her nostrils. So you do see this culture that is like, how do we treat women like ladies, but how do we control them? And so that difference is just kind of important and interesting to me to notice things like this, because it speaks a lot to the tensions around gender and gender roles and gender interactions that fueled both the suffrage and anti-suffrage movements. And it also shows that, suffragettes from different countries were interacting. Alice Paul was from America, but she became a part of this too. So yeah, this force-feeding treatment had a little bit of precedent, but had rarely really been used on people, especially like people who weren't like huge enemies of the state. Like these women had like committed crimes, but like this is not common. It had hitherto been primarily used on asylum patients who were sometimes considered incapable of feeling hungry and eating properly. So here we once again see the effects of years and years of treating women as unreasonable and incapable and similar to quote unquote mad people. And that's also why Mary Lay in her account is like, you got to prove that I'm crazy before you can force food through my mouth. She has a point. She knows her stuff. She's an intelligent woman. So, like I said, she brought it to court because after experiencing all of those painful things that she described, she was like, this must be illegal in England. So she sued the Secretary of the Home Office, Gladstone, bringing the issue and ethics of force feeding to court. And also, once again, this is making it very public and allowing the cause to draw attention to itself and its issues, the suffrage cause. So in this court case, you have a lot of doctors arguing about a lot of things. You have a lot of equivocating. There's arguing about the difference between rectal and nasal feeding and which one's better to force feed through. And there's a doctor who finds less fault with the force feeding itself than that they're not feeding the women good, nutritious food that's enough to sustain life. So, there's a lot of arguments, but genuinely the arguments are around, the main argument is like, is this force feeding legal? Is it justified? If it becomes absolutely necessary, but also some of it just comes down to them kind of trying to argue and think about all of the loopholes and complications and how to make it more justifiable or make it seem better in some ways. But like it all kind of comes down to these kinds of interactions. Like the Attorney General / questioner in one part says, any process, however repulsive or disgusting, which is necessary to save the patient's life, you will of course allow. And the doctor answers, yes. So these kinds of interactions encourage the government to decide that it was legal to force feed these women in order to save their lives. So it is allowed to continue for a while. Many objections arise. And we're going to see later that the government has to come up with a sort of loophole or sort of backtrack because of this. But even though they decide that continuing to force feed these women and make them go through this horrendous process, the court case also causes people to pay attention to these women's bodies, to their personhood, to their lived experiences. And newspapers surrounding the case, the debate continues to rage on suffrage and about why women should be treated as conscientious political objectors. There's some people named H.N. Brailsford and Henry W. Nevinson who criticized Gladstone, saying, quote, he insists on classing women who are fighting for an idea with ordinary criminals. And to the hunger strike, he has now replied with the loathsome expedient of the stomach tube. The women protested against humiliating punishments. He proceeds to make the infliction of these humiliations possible by a method which, besides being certainly nauseating and probably dangerous, it is dangerous, by the way, is an unpardonable outrage on human dignity, end quote. And they published this objection in the newspaper, The Times, and other such objections continued. One of my favorite is there are some suffragettes named Kitty Marion, Constance Lytton, and Emmeline Pethick Lawrence. And they say, also in the Times, quote, we want to make it known that we shall carry on our protest in our prison cells. We shall put before the government by means of the hunger strike 4 alternatives: to release us in a few days, to inflict violence upon our bodies, to add death to the champions of our cause by leaving us to starve, or, and this is the best and only wise alternative, to give women the vote. We appeal to the government to yield, not to the violence of our protest, but to the reasonableness of our demand, and to grant the vote to the duly qualified women of the country. We shall then serve our full sentence quietly and obediently and without complaint. Our protest is against the action of the government in opposing women's suffrage and against that alone We have no quarrel with those who may be ordered to maltreat us. End quote. I think that is a very eloquently and well-written stance for the suffragettes, even though the government decided that it was legal to force feed them and everything. You see that constantly these women are determined to make a statement, and they're committed to one cause. And I think they do a great job in differentiating between the violence of our protest and the difficult issue of force feeding with, like, we're just upset that we don't have the vote and all we want is the vote. And the reason we've been committing crimes is because we want the vote. And we will be obedient once we are respected. And I think that's powerful. I think those words really speak for themselves, but they do so much work in those little paragraphs. So shout out to Kitty Marion, Constance Lynn, and Emmeline Pethick Lawrence. Yeah, it's really surprising from a modern standpoint that all they needed to do was give women the vote. I mean, it is also easy to understand that, like, governments often come to these things where they, like, parents, they don't want to, like, go back on their word. Like, if they said, you're going to get in trouble for doing this, they don't want to give people what they want, not get them in trouble for doing the thing that they're not supposed to do, like a crime or disobeying the government. But it is really crazy to think about the fact that the British government would rather be in this weird situation with strange ethics and, like, prisoner of war type stuff than just let women vote. And I think that goes to show how deeply embedded this assumption about women and women's roles was to these people. It felt so necessary to enforce. It felt like society was founded upon it, and it really took a lot of effort and passionate people and a lot of time to remind people that, like, women can do this. They don't need to be controlled. They're fierce. They will find a way to get what they want. And, like, you don't need to be afraid of society crumbling if women get a seat at the table. We call that the cult of domesticity, the idea that women belong at the home and the men in the world of politics. And at this moment, you see that it's breaking apart and people don't know how to let that happen calmly, really. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how the WSPU continues to capitalize on these force feedings and on this movement and what they can do with this type of political action. So the WSPU has a newspaper called The Suffragette. Very on the nose, very good name. And they publish drawings of forcible feedings on their cover pages for the shock value. I'm also going to post all of these with the podcast. And if you're unable to see them where you're listening to your podcast, I'm going to have a website. I'm going to have a page. There'll be something, or like uploads on YouTube, which will also have these images with them. So the first image that they publish is a very visceral image of a woman struggling and being held down in this, like, chair/bed, and she's being fed through the nostril. Her eyes are wide open in a horrified expression. And it reads, quote, treatment of political prisoners. And so, they're kind of making a statement, first of all, that they are political prisoners, whether the government recognizes them as such or not. And they're also saying that the government in power, the current party and the current power, they're not helping us. They're not being very true to their promises. They're letting violations like this happen. There's another image that shows these really creepy looking prison workers. They kind of give, like, Dr. Frankenstein vibes. And they're carrying this weak woman into a door, and the door says torture, forcible feeding, kind of this way. So you kind of get the vibe that these images are communicating about this mass evil violation on women's bodies that they're putting out there. So, all these disputes against force feeding also have to do with standards around respect for women's body, what it means to perform violence against them. Indeed, suffragettes could and sometimes did frame this experience with valences of prostitution, rape, and sexual assaults. Miller writes, quote, "Yet the fact that force feeding was mostly performed on female prisoners proved particularly emotive and helped to propel the issue to public attention in this initial period when ethical debates were formed. In the act of force feeding, broader socio-political debates were played out directly on the female body. By playing upon the gendered aspects of force feeding, militant suffragettes proved adept at drawing out the emotive issue of inflicting pain upon a woman." End quote. He also says, quote, "In many ways, the feeding of politically motivated women against their will represented the ultimate expression of contemporary gender relations. Force feeding was performed at the will of a male-led government and male prison doctors. In attempting to reassert authority over her own body, the hunger-striking female found herself subjected to a physical procedure that, in her accounts, shared similarities to oral rape as it was accompanied with force and intimidation." End quote. And I think a lot of these images at the time evoke those kinds of Gothic fears about sexual danger, sexual violence, and also just physical violence against women. The WSPU also began awarding medals to survivors of force feeding. So there's one that is on display at this library. And it says, the description of the item is, quote, "Hunger Strike Medal in original presentation box awarded to Maud Joachim by the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU. The lined interior of the box lid is printed in gilt. Presented to Maud Joachim by the Women's Social and Political Union in recognition of a gallant action whereby, through endurance to the last extremity of hunger and hardship, a great principle of political justice was vindicated. This girl named Maud, quote, was arrested in Dundee on 20th October 1909, along with fellow suffragettes Adela Pankhurst, Helen Archdale, Catherine Corbett, and Laura Evans. They had interrupted a meeting led by Winston Churchill the previous day by leading a crowd and shouting, 'This way, votes for women.' Maud was sent to prison, where she was released after a 4-day hunger strike. She was fed by force while serving another prison sentence in March 1912. So they're making sure that these women are honored as heroes for doing something that was very difficult, that was for a cause. And this kind of goes back to that Joan of Arc thing, like fighting for like an important cause and being valiant. And I also just love that they got arrested by, they just interrupted a meeting by Winston Churchill, and he was just mad enough about it. I feel like to get them arrested, like they just were like shouting things, and that was enough to get them arrested. Like that's also the crazy thing. Like suffragettes did a lot of crazy things at this time. I listed a bunch of them at the beginning of the podcast, but sometimes they literally just like stood in front of buildings and said things and got arrested for it. So it's like they're just speaking their minds, guys. And also what happens in these hunger strikes is that there are women of all ages protesting as part of this movement. So I think like, at least we often have this vision nowadays of young women being the suffragettes, the younger generation being the one wanting change. But oftentimes, for one, a lot of anti-suffrage posters were portraying women as these old maids. So there was actually this assumption that they were older, and there were actually older ones. And so there's a huge age range. Like this is an intergenerational movement, which I also think makes it really cool. So, for example, in the National Archives of the UK, we have an example of a suffragette who went on hunger strike in the prison. Her name was Sarah Bennett, and she claimed that she was 63 years old, but one of the prison workers said that they thought that she was probably even older than that. And she was lying to be able to, keep on hunger striking and participate in the movement. And they were worried that she was not doing very well because she hadn't been eating. And they were like, she's just a frail old woman. We don't really want to force feed her. I think that's very tender. And it just shows that old and young they're all willing to go through some very harrowing things and even try and pretend they're younger or fight against the needs of their bodies to make it through the situation and get the votes. And like that's very well illustrated with the Pankhursts too, because you have their mom, Emmeline, and her friends, and then her 2 daughters all participating in this movement. So this was important to a lot of people from different, they were born in different time periods, and it was important to all of them. People continue to write petitions and letters to officials against force feeding as well. So in addition to those newspaper articles I read earlier, there's like official petitions and official letters addressed directly to officials. There are several of these. There's a lot. So I think that goes to show how effective making this a public kind of statement was. So it's a petition from suffrage supporters to Reginald McKenna, who is now the Secretary of State to the Home Office, and reads, quote, "We, the undersigned, earnestly plead that you will accord to the women suffragists," which is interesting. We were just talking about this at the beginning. Yeah. Did they get confused? They say suffragists, but these people went on hunger strike. And the ones who were way more likely to get arrested were suffragettes. So I don't know if that's a mistake or not. But see, it was even confusing to people back then. Sentence in connection with the political demonstration of last March, the status of political prisoners, owing to the fact that they are being treated as ordinary common criminals in Aylesbury Prison, they have adopted the hunger strike. And we view with horror the attempt to coerce them into submission by recourse to the cruel and dangerous practice of forcible feeding. We urge you to put an end to this treatment and to accord to political prisoners the conditions which they obtain in all other civilized countries of the world. So that's pretty powerful, and I think very important too, because the national identity of Britain was to be very civilized, and this really contrasted with that, which is also what made it such a shock to people and what made it so objectable to so many people to see this happening. But yeah, I don't know if they're right or wrong about the suffragists in that. It could be possible. The movements, although opposed, weren't totally opposed and everything, but since they were arrested, it's far more likely that they were suffragettes, and they might have used the word suffragists to gain more sympathy. I don't know.
Who wrote it again?
This is a bunch of petitioners. I have their names.
If they're petitioners, maybe they just didn't know the difference.
Maybe they just didn't know the difference. Yeah. It's just a bunch of petitioners. Here are the names: A. Wallace, Janet Lees, Louisa Potter, J. McIntosh, Alina Aldred, L.A. Tiernan, D. McIntosh, Alice Waters, S.M. Making, M.A. Stone, M.L. Stone, D.A. Stone, Kate Waters, etc., etc., etc. So, maybe they didn't know. Something to think about at night, guys. Something to think about. So, in response to all this, in 1913, we get a thing that's colloquially called the Cat and Mouse Act. Dun, dun, dun. And some of the things I described might have happened a little bit after this act passed, but this act is definitely in response to the frustration with seeing force feeding and experiencing force feeding by the public. So basically the government is like, okay, we got to straddle this difficult situation because force feeding the women is no longer looking good on us. Letting them go, we still don't want to do that. We still don't want them to die either. So basically this act, it has all the different clauses that laws have and all the clarifications and everything. But essentially the thing to understand about what this law means is all right, if women come in and they hunger strike and they are getting sick and they're unhealthy and they're in need of medical attention, then what we're going to do is we are going to let them go on temporary suspension, temporary release. And then if their sentences aren't up or they haven't finished being sentenced, once they get healthy again, we're going to find them, and we're going to make them come back to prison. So that's why it's called cat and mouse, because it's basically like Tom and Jerry, and, they catch the mouse, they let it go, they catch it, they let it go. So it's just a weird cycle of women going to jail, not eating, getting out of jail, protesting more usually when they're out of jail, and doing more things while they're on this temporary release, and then going back to jail. So basically, the government ends up getting a population of adult women going in and out of jail. Pretty great. Just kidding. So it looks pretty unsavory to be sticking tubes down nostrils. So they'd rather just be like, not give women the vote. But what we're going to do, you look sick, you haven't eaten, get out of jail, go eat something, come back here. So that is kind of what happens. And the sad thing is there's a great mystery of where that would ultimately lead, because World War I happens the next year in 1914. But during the Cat and Mouse Act, we know suffragettes did still continue to hunger strike and participate in this process because, like that girl I mentioned earlier, Sarah Bennett, the wonderful old lady who they thought was lying about her age, she was probably... The letter for her release has language like that in the Cat and Mouse Act. So they were probably authorizing her release under the Cat and Mouse Act. And there's a lot of records in that same National Archives set that have some other suffragettes who were also released for the same reasons under the Cat and Mouse Act. One of the popular ones was that her breath was smelly, and she was smelly because she wasn't eating. Apparently, I think that's actually like scientifically true. If you don't eat for a long time, you start to get halitosis or something. I'm not a doctor, by the way. Don't count me on that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of that in these release papers. Like, hey, this woman, her breath ain't smelling good. Her pulse is quick. She looks kind of pale. Can we release her on temporary release? And they're like, yeah. So yeah, World War I happened. And both the WSPU and the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was kind of unfortunately left out this episode, but they're pretty awesome. I'll tell you a couple facts about them actually really quick. They love doing parades in all white. They're gorgeous parades if you look at them. So they just did a lot of peaceful parades about giving women the vote. There are parades that the WSPU did as well. So some of these parades look similar, but the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies did this, and they just held a bunch of peaceful meetings in the streets, in the parks. One of them would get up on a stand and talk about why women should have the vote. There's Millicent Garrett Fawcett was kind of the leader of that. You can look up her papers and her arguments about why women should have the vote. And she does a great job of going through the British laws and talking about how all of the British laws are unfair to women, and women are the only ones who are capable of truly changing them or truly understanding how to change them to actually improve the day-to-day lives of women. So, yes. Both these groups put suffrage on hold to join in the war effort because the country kind of unified. So, they would do ambulances. Unfortunately, some of them participated in handing white feathers to men who didn't sign up to fight in war and were like, you're a coward, go fight in the war. Because they thought that would make them look good. But it was kind of mean. So it's not until the end of World War I, after this, that women finally get the vote. Yay!
Yay!
Yay! Women! But they can't vote until they're 30. And they gotta be married and or own property too.
No.
I know. But in 1928, they achieve what both the WSPU and the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies wanted. And that is the vote on equal terms to men. And they can vote at 21, and there's not the property requirements. Finally, they get that same vote that those working men from the Labor Party got a while back. So yeah, as with like all history, it's not possible to make a definitive judgment on what the hunger strike did or did not do for the movement because of all these intersecting factors. But no matter what, I will say that it was a serious effort on the part of many to be seen and heard and battle out their beliefs. It was hard to clear space for women on the political stage, so some of them made their own battleground, their bodies and minds, and I admire them for that. My respect and love goes out to all those who were involved in this messy historical moment, and I am sure glad to have the right to vote. Woo!
Oh yeah.
Yay!
I think it's just really complicated, you know. It's like, you know, these prisons, obviously they don't want people to die.
Yeah.
But it's like an awful thing you have to do to keep them alive. So it's like, it's just such a weird balance of like, okay, well, obviously you don't want people to die. That's a bad thing. People dying is a bad thing.
Yeah.
But like, you know, they're choosing not to eat. But it's just hard because, like, I guess you could just let them starve.
Right. And like
die.
A lot of them were making these associations based off of like popular literary characters at the time and popular assumptions about like women's psyches that like, oh, these are mad suicidal women. But like they weren't suicidal. They were just kind of trying to battle it out on the last battleground they had left for the vote, which was their own physical bodies and minds.
Yeah, I guess when you're in prison, that's like the last thing you can really control, you know. They've taken everything away from you.
Yeah.
And like kind of the ability to eat and stuff like that. It's like the last thing you can really control.
Yeah.
Like that's the last, maybe it's just like the last thing you can,
you know,
they've taken everything away from you, but you can take away like your right to eat. That's the last thing you can control.
Yeah. Like there's a lot of instances of this throughout history of women doing very bold things to kind of try and take back control from a society that tries to micromanage or, you know, ignore them. But yeah, it is definitely complicated though. Like that's the thing. It's like real life. It's like how the modern current moment is complicated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was complicated. But I really admire them. And I really do think that those girls that wrote the letter to the Times, it's just fire.
Mm-hmm.
The best and only wise alternative to give women the vote.
I mean, obviously, the best solution to this entire problem is just giving women the vote. But like besides that, it's just like a really complicated, and it's like, okay, well, you don't feed them, they die, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like, you don't want that. What's worse, you know, force feeding or someone dying? It's just like,
yeah, and that's what the court case.
Yeah, that's what the court case
came down to, and that's why the decision was in favor of the prison wardens and the doctors, because the government was like, keeping our citizens alive comes first to us. And yeah, it's also something that this is something I don't have an answer to, but I kind of want everybody to kind of think about tonight. Is like, what is it that was so embedded about these ideas of gender that they felt so important to people that this seemed like a better alternative than giving women the vote? Mm-hmm. You know? And we've discussed that like part of it is because like the women who were doing it were the women who had committed crimes and things like that. So I definitely see that angle. But I think it's really important to think about history. I think it's important to think about how like the differences between like fears and compassions and how strong like the narratives we tell ourselves and the ideas that we tell ourselves are to kind of physical outcomes in the real world, you know? They have real power. And we have real power to make change and bring hope to the world and fight for what we think is right.
Mm-hmm. I think it really shows you like how much they really wanted the vote. They were literally...
Right. When they'd been fighting for it for decades, too, at this point.
They started themselves.
Like decades. Yeah. So it's so crazy. But yeah, the government, a lot of people really thought that somehow society would crumble, like social order would crumble if women got the vote. And so they really did things like this. And so it's like,
I mean, if it's like, I guess, was it kind of like a fear of change? Like, oh, you know, you kind of let women into society, or because it's like a very, well, I don't know if it's not a very new idea, but it's like, it's a new idea. And it's like, you know, something that has been standard for a long time. It's almost like we'll do anything to stop this, you know, from happening. Because it's just like, you're at like the last forefront. These like men, they're like, oh, we just can't let this happen. Like, you know, if we let women vote, they're gonna like, are they gonna like take over the government, or they're gonna like take over policy, or they're gonna like, what was like the argument against like women voting? Kind of, was it like, oh, they're gonna like ruin society basically?
so one of the I had in one of my classes, my teacher asked us to put on our anti-suffrage caps and try and think like people back then. But I think it was actually useful to think about what was going on in this moment. Not to say, huge disclaimer, this is not to say like these people were wrong. Women should have the right to vote. Women are smart. Women are capable. Women are wonderful. But it's to say that, like, in understanding history, it doesn't necessarily help us to always make these snap judgments, but it helps us to look at the nuances and the both sides, like you've been trying to do. And so one of the main arguments is people thought that women were like the moral guardians of the time. Like, women were responsible for keeping society moral. And this is actually why the suffragettes are like, if we're responsible for keeping society moral, why shouldn't we be making like the laws that guide the morality of society? But the idea was that the political sphere was inherently corrupt, which I think is actually an idea that we still have in many ways today, that it's like hard for politics to not have some level of corruption. And so the idea was that politics were corrupt. So then if women got involved in politics, they'd become more corrupted and wouldn't guard the morals of the home that made the building blocks of society anymore.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's weird. It's weird. It's not how we think. And once again, it's really interesting because, especially like as a woman myself who would have wanted to vote at this time if I had been alive, the suffragettes and the suffragists themselves also could actually use, like, these same ideas were used by both sides for like different reasons, because like women were thought of being responsible for the home, and at the time the home and the family were thought to be like a mini model of society. So like if you raised a good person in the home, they could go out and be a good member of society. So the suffragettes and suffragists were like, oh, if we're supposed to raise the good members of society, then we should be able to vote, make the good building blocks of society, but also we should be able to vote because there are laws that actually affect like what we can do in our homes and like how our children are raised and like how school is for our kids and stuff like that. So like we should have a part in that, because part of raising kids now is being able to like make the votes. But then, yeah, on the other hand, men were like, oh no, like women, they can't get into this dirty world of politics. But also part of it is just the fear, like as a man, like one of your sole purposes in Victorian society was to go out and work and provide for your family. And when you come home, your happy little wife and your happy little kids are waiting for you to be like, yay, Papa, you did it. You're a good man. You provided for us. You were tough and strong and responsible. And so part of it, too, is that, like, they're just men having existential crises of, like, what is my purpose in life if the women are doing it, too?
I see.
Yeah. So sorry. That was a long answer.
No, I mean, that was a good answer. I didn't know if it was more like, oh, they're going to take our land and our, like, I don't know if, like, it was reflected in, like, the anti-suffrage propaganda. Or anything like that. But that was a very interesting kind of oversight of like kind of the reasons. Kind of, it's not the one you expect, really.
Yeah, it's not the one you
I'm sure
expect.
There's a lot of reasons too. I'm sure there's a lot of
there's so many and
opinions.
Like if you have more questions, I'm going to read my email to you now. So first of all, I really hope everybody enjoyed this episode. If you did, feel free to share this podcast with your friends and family and consider subscribing. If you have any questions or requests, especially more questions about the suffrage movement, I'm happy to get into the very nitty-gritty stuff about some of these beliefs and everything.
Or just questions in general, too.
But also just questions in general about British history. I might even be able to answer them in an episode. You can email me at albiontonight@gmail.com. That's albiontonight@gmail.com. And I will do my best to answer as many as I can. And as you can see, I can be very detailed with my answers. So I'm happy to go into as much detail as you want, or as little detail as you want to. These episodes are meant to spark curiosity and healthy conversations about the past and present, to look into both sides. And I'm happy to engage with questions and comments as productively as I can. So thank you so much again for listening and learning with me today. I'm so happy to have a chance to share my passion with the world. You will not want to miss the next episode. It's going to be not the next week, but the week after. We're posting bi-weekly. Nope. Semi-weekly.
Semi-weekly, that's the word.
We are posting semi-weekly. You will not want to miss it. We're going to be talking about beans on toast.
Yeah, a little bit more lighthearted.
And the origin. Yeah, hopefully, unless I discover some dark things about beans on toast.
Oh, no.
One last little note, too. I did start a Patreon. It's under Brooke @ Albion Tonight. And yeah, if you really like this, if you want to help support me and being able to spend more time and effort on making these podcasts really great and really fun, and also eventually I'm going to set up some polls on there so you can have some say in what you get to hear on the podcast, and also set up some benefits and bonus episodes once we get enough members. But yeah, if you just really like this podcast, if you want to support a girl who loves history and is just having a rough time after graduating college, just feel free to. But yeah,
keep it ad free, you know.
Yeah, all the good stuff. I promise you only good stuff, guys. So yeah, see you next time. I'll be on in 2 weeks.